Today on the Skid Factory, we're steering you in the right direction with a little bit of science and a fair bit of YouTube. Welcome back to the Crown Factory. Since we left last week, we have sort of carried on with some of the stuff we talked about at the end of the last episode in regards to steering and suspension layout. So we have gone ahead and changed the caster rods from the front of the chassis to the rear of the chassis. I picked out all these out of the old chassis, which is what were the mounts up here, just to sort of see how they looked at the back here. Matt Tomasini came around. Too many Matts, isn't there?
So many Matts.
And had a bit of a look over it, and he didn't seem to think that this was a very practical shape given how we were going to connect it to the chassis, so he just used that as a sort of design base and made up a CAD design for it, then cut out some plates which I then bent and welded, and it's just tacked in at the moment because everything's sort of in the process of being worked out more or less. So they're in both sides. I have got the steering rack in there. Again, Matt gave me a bunch of time with that. We got a UC Tirana steering rack, so late 70s. It's been shortened 5 inches, and I've also pulled it down and rebuilt it and modified the ends of the rack to suit modern rack ends, so we don't have to use adjustable old school stuff. It's got Subaru rack and tire ends on it now at the moment, but that may change. It's just a very common thread. I wasn't overly sure of what to do as far as mounting the rack. I consulted with both the mod plate engineer and some other mechanical engineer guys just via the grapevine, and then got Matt Tomasini in. We came up with a plan that goes along with the guidelines, and he's a chassis builder, like truck chassis builder, so he's all about where gussets go and how things should be done and what type of materials to use and what sort of welding to do. So he came in and gave me a day of his time, and we nutted through it and worked it out. It's all done now, and I'm pretty happy with it. It actually fits quite well given how much the rack's been shortened. Just with regards to shortening the steering rack, you normally can't do this with a power steering rack, but with an old school manual one like this you can, particularly this design. That's why they do it to these ones, because they've got two ends and a sort of pressed tube in between. Shortening it doesn't actually change the way the rack operates within reason, unless what the catch is the more you shorten it, the further the pinion goes in to the middle of the chassis, and the engine is usually in the way. So it's pretty much been shortened as much as it can with regards to the sump and that and clearance. We've left ourselves a bit of space here to shim the rack forward or back or whatever according to what's needed, and basically what we want to do now is trying to work out the steering, as far as the steering arms, to set up the suspension to travel through its arc without having bump steer. Bump steer is basically the main thing that is mentioned in the like the code of practice or whatever for doing a rack conversion, is don't induce bump steer. So we're going to have a look at that and show you why it does it and how to prevent it, and also how to measure it. Before we get into steering stuff, we just got to fit up the brake kit from Hopper Stoppers. They still make a Crown brake kit, which they probably originally made in like 1982 or something. This kit uses a 300mm Ford rotor and a AU3 caliper, dual piston. I'm pretty sure it's the same components as the Hucko and the Bedford, and what else have we done?
Lee's Tirana.
Yeah, and they just use different brackets to suit, so obviously a pretty handy bit of gear. We're just putting everything on dry at the moment. There's no grease in the bearings or anything like that. It's just all for space testing and that sort of thing to make sure nothing runs into other things through the suspension range. It's easier to find out now and do something about it than wait till we're finally bolting it together in 6 months' time and finding out that it doesn't work then.
6 months' time, you'll be at Gus's form.
Shut up. As usual, they're pretty straightforward to bolt on, but you do have to read the instructions. There was some clearancing that needed to be done to certain things just because of the age of the car, and there was a few variations between crowns with Australian and imported models. So we got that sorted, all in the instructions. It's worth noting that you can get a 4-piston billet caliper as well for these, and I think you can get a larger rotor as well if you want to go big wheels, but in my case I would have got the 4-piston calipers, but the wheels that I've got, there's just no clearance for them, so I'm just going to go with these. These work great anyway. So steering wise, as we talked about earlier, what we've done is swap the steering from the rear to the front. We've also swapped around the steering arm. So the steering arm is kind of like what we're concentrating on now. The shape of these arms is very specific to every vehicle and wheelbase length, and the reason for that is a thing called Acumen Angle. So the very basic version of it is that if you draw a straight line from that steering joint there through the bottom ball joint, with the wheel straight ahead, it normally points at the centre of your third member, so your diff. Or the diff pinion if the diff's in the middle. So that's kind of the basis of was described to me years ago when I used to work at a steering shop many years ago. The front of the car turns the car, the rear of the car steers it, so it's all connected, and these angles are important to a point. It can be a bit voodoo because you don't really know why it's like that, but in this case we'll just explain what's going on here. So this used to be on the right hand side facing the rear, so when we swap it over to this side and put it on the front, it does still track through to the centre of where the centre of the third member is, or the diff. The problem is, and this is a problem on many older cars, you can't put a wheel on it because of where that is. So on the stuff like Holdens that have a front steering setup, this here it either needs to be further back in here behind this rotor, or it needs to be moved outwards. And what a lot of the old GM stuff was they just moved it outwards because they only had they had 14-inch wheels on them, or 13s even in Tiranas, so they didn't have the wheel space to actually put this where it was meant to be, so they just moved it outwards, and that actually wrecked the theoretical Acumen Angle of them, which caused issues with handling back in the late 60s and up to mid 70s, when they came up with a thing called radial tune suspension, which was basically just our car's handle steered like let's fix it, and call it radial tune suspension because that's marketing. So by that time they probably were putting larger wheels on them so they could do something about this. There was also problems with the way the top control arm was mounted and other things as well, and it wasn't just Holden's, it was also other GM products that had the same issues. This car, this is kind of copied off a GM sort of, but it appears that they put a little bit more effort into it because it doesn't appear to have the problems that some of the GM stuff did. Our problem is that we've put a steering rack in it, and it's not obviously the same as what the steering box and linkage was. So we've got to go through and test, basically cut this off and change the shape of it and try and make it run through its suspension arc without affecting the toe, so there's no bump steer. So that's what we're going to do. I've already chopped off the other side and we're going to have a bit of a go at that. I can't actually bolt the wheel on because I've only got a 15-inch wheel, and even a 15 won't fit on with that there, so we're going to go to the other side and have a play around there. Changing plans, I'm going to have to cut this one off as well because we can't actually put the wheel on with it in one piece, so chop chop. It's probably worthwhile saying that we're not actually using these particular arms. All we're doing is cutting them up, welding them back together and establishing the shape of the arm in practice so that we can then remove them once we get it right and have them made out of a piece of billet steel. So you can't cut and weld arms.
If you're alright if it was a drift car though, can you do that? Can you shorten?
Yeah, you can only cut and weld arms if you're a drifter, alright? You can't use these on the road, cut and welded. It's not allowed in Australia.
Don't forget the gas. It's the oldest trick in the book, Alan.
I've cut up both steering arms and actually made them different angles and extensions. One's a bit shorter than the other, one's further out and longer. Sort of pushing the limits there and a bit more safe over here. So now we're going to get out the Bumpmaster 8000 and see if my YouTube research works. This is the Bumpmaster 8000. That's what they're called in Australia. In America, I think they're called Bumpomatic 3. In Europe, I think it's called the Bumpenstein Mark 9. But it's basically the same thing. This gets strapped onto the wheel, like so, with some KTM rear wheel straps.
Oh. Is that a shark laser?
I took the shark off. It wasn't happy. Cranky little things. This is kind of like a crude wheel aligning machine. It just projects a laser onto this mirror over here and back onto this plate. As with doing any wheel alignment, you have to make sure you've got no movement in your bearings or anything in the steering system, because 1 millimeter is not very much, and that's too much for toe. So everything's got to be nice and tight, and otherwise you're wasting your time. It'll just be all over the place. So strapped on, we've got the super cheap laser here, projects over to the 4X mirror. I don't know if we're going to get close enough, Russ.
That thing's a collector's item, Alan.
There we go. You don't actually have to use a mirror back onto there, but that's just the way I did it on how they did it on the YouTube video that I watched. You can calculate it just by projecting it onto a wall, but I know the calculations to do it this way, so that's the way we're going to do it. You want the Bumpmaster to be level, so the laser that's sitting on it's got a little level on it, like a spirit level, so we've got that level. So the steering rack's centered, absolutely centered. It's been measured pretty accurately. Then you adjust your rack end, or what we use to adjust your toe, so this is straight. Then we put it at ride height. So what your ride height is up to you. So you've got to sort of nominate where you think that the wheel's going to sit. This is our nominated ride height or centre. So we've got the projection there. You just make a mark along there. Then we'll go down to bump, so onto the bump stop. And we can see the distance it's moved. And then we'll go up to extension. Which is about there.
Oh, Nelly.
So you can see it's moved a long way away. This is basically an example of that's bad bump steer. That means that this wheel's going like that when it's going through the range. And there's ways you can fix this, but in our case we've actually got those steering arms chopped up, so we've got free free rein to do what we want, and you basically just got to move the steering, the point around and see what happens. So we've done the other side. I basically welded on and cut off that particular steering end 8 times, I think, and just kept checking it and observing what the changes were. And there is some rules of thumb. If it toes in, goes to centre and toes out, that means that you need to lengthen the rack end or shorten it, depending on which side of the control arm it is. If it goes from one side to the other, you need to lift it up or down, that sort of thing. And that is also specific to where the rack is mounted. So what I did was just change things and observe, and then if it made it worse, I went the other way, and eventually, this is actually not terrible. This is probably as good as our first guess was on the other side. But eventually, after about 8 times, I just happened to get it right. So it's on the other side, it's within a millimetre, not even a millimetre of toe, once you calculate your distances and stuff like that. So basically what you want at the end of the day is that to stay on that line. If that red thing stays on that line, then you've got no bump steer.
Let's swap over and check just to show the other side.
Right, the Bumpmaster 8000 set up on this left-hand side, which I've already done and got right. We'll find out in a second. She's all levelled up. The laser's pointing at what's the 4X guy's name?
I don't know.
Pointing at his
What I noticed though,
near his underarm.
Was he wearing a Subaru hat?
Yeah, this was made by Gov Ivor way back in the day when he used to do stuff like this.
Oh, true. So it's not actually.
And when I was in,
So it's
this was
counterfeit.
before the shed was built. It's been here since the shed was built.
Counterfeit for ex-memorabilia.
Yeah, with a Subaru hat though. So anyway, it's doing the job. So we've got it at ride height. The idea is that laser line stays at that R mark. That means that it's not moving. So let's try it out. We'll go to bump first. So we've got a tiny bit of movement off the line. So there is a little bit, but to check that actual amount, which we will later, you've got to do some measurements, and we'll go up to extension. I didn't see what it was doing, but it obviously just goes come back and go back in. So that's good. Well, this is where it was before. That was like 5 mil of toe out on extension. It was pretty good on compression, on bump, but can you get your calculator out?
Sure. Where's the Grummy? He's got it maths.
Yeah, he is good at maths, but he still couldn't work it out with his head. 1735. Go again.
Is that 0.33?
0.33 mil
toe
of toe.
in.
Yeah.
So that's a lot, Alan.
No, it's not. I feel like we've reached the summit of the difficult steering mountain here, and we're about to go down the other side. I'm really stoked with how this has turned out. It's been quite difficult and has taken up a lot of my sort of brain thought processes, and I've also had a bunch of help from other people that are smart. The 2 Matts, Pete and Duncan from Hopper Stoppers, heaps of YouTube channels. Shout out to Home Built by Jeff and to the Binky lads. I watched heaps of videos, and there's a lot of good information out there on stuff like this. And I can't remember who made the homemade Bumpmaster 8000, but that was a good one too. It's great to be able to see changes. That's how you know when this thing you're looking at is working, is when you move something and it does that, and then you move it back and it does the opposite, and that sort of thing. So that's when you know you're on the right track. So just took hours and hours of cutting off and welding back on and moving things around, and all of a sudden I got it, and that was awesome. So super stoked about that. That's all we got time for this week. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit up the merch store. Helps us out, helps us build cool
Hit the bell and tell your mum about
Hit
us.
the bell and tell your grandma to hit the bell, and tell Woody's mum to hit the bell.
There goes the bell.
Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
How good are milk crates, eh?
They're handy for carrying milk and other things.
Considering that the guy that does your wheel alignment just holds the wheels and then presses print when it says 0 when it's actually like 2 mil already toe in, so I know that you do that, wheel alignment guy.
I used to do wheel alignments, and it was way harder to do back in the day. We had
What, shims and...
primitive wheel alignment machines that you had to jack up the wheel and do run out and all this, and geez, it was a big job. And then everything was rusted out and had shims, and I've done the hard yards, don't worry.
Was it like as part of the service schedule or something?
Well,
20k service, adjust. What were service schedules back in the day?
I don't know, it's before my time.
Adjust steering rack, 5,000 miles.
So if it's doing this, it needs adjusting.
You got a big rack, Alice.
Mad rack. It's all natural, bros.
No, that's purchased. What are you talking about? They're bolt-ons.
Oh, these racks. I got bolt-on racks as well.
Roger. You need like a height marker for Roger. We should start him on when he's a puppy against the hoist.
You'd have to do it every day, because
Is that right?
Roger, what you doing?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's spot on. Hey everybody!
Spaz.
What's going on?